The message was never meant to be heard. Daravas recorded it in the dark of the Last Breath's command deck, with the emergency lighting casting everything in the dim red of failing power systems, and 40,000 of her people sleeping in corridors and cargo bays, and every available space, because there was nowhere else for them to go. She recorded it at 300 station time because she could not sleep, and because the life support diagnostic she had just reviewed gave them 6 days, and she had spent 3 hours sitting with that number before deciding what to do with it. What she decided was this: someone should know who they were. Not a distress call, not a formal transmission. She had sent 4 distress calls in the 11 days since the Krath Dominion had reduced the Sauran home world to a debris field, and 4 distress calls had produced 4 silences, and she was done with distress calls. What she recorded instead was a memorial. Specific, detailed, honest. The kind of document you made when you understood that making it was the last useful thing you could do. She listed their achievements first. 6,000 years of civilization. The medical advances that had eliminated 17 diseases across their species. The agricultural techniques that had fed a world of 8 billion. The architectural tradition that had produced structures of such beauty that 3 other civilizations maintained museums dedicated to Sauran design. She listed their art forms, their philosophical schools, their scientific contributions, the specific names of the researchers who had made them. Then she listed their children. 4,216 children aboard the Last Breath. She listed them by age cohort. How many were under 5? How many were between 5 and 10? How many were old enough to understand what had happened to their world and young enough that it would shape everything they ever became? She listed them first among the living, before the engineers and the doctors and the teachers and the farmers and the elderly survivors who had watched their world end from orbit. Before all of them, the children listed first because they were the whole point. They were the only point. Everything else the Sauran had ever been was preparation for the generation that would carry it forward. And that generation was 4,216 children sleeping in cargo bays on a ship with 6 days of life support. She recorded for 40 minutes. When she was done, she reviewed it once and then transmitted it on every frequency her damaged communications array could reach. And then she turned off her console and sat in the red emergency light and waited. She expected nothing. What she got, 6 hours and 17 minutes later, was 17 ships dropping out of FTL simultaneously, surrounding the Last Breath in a formation so precise and so immediate that her tactical officer thought it was an attack and had his hand on the emergency bulkhead controls before the first hail came through. The hail was in her language, not translated, actually in her language, correctly conjugated, spoken with an accent that was identifiably not native but was clearly practiced. The voice was male, calm, and sounded like someone who had been awake for a long time and had no particular intention of sleeping soon. It said, "This is Governor Marcus Webb, Kepler Station, United Earth Administration. We received your message. We're here. What do you need first?" Daravas sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Life support. We have 6 days." Webb said, "Understood. Medical teams are docking now. Give me 30 minutes for a full assessment and then we'll talk." She looked at her tactical officer. He looked at her. Neither of them had words for what had just happened, because what had just happened was outside the vocabulary they had available for things that happened in the world. "She want to meet the humans." Webb came aboard the Last Breath himself. She had not expected that. She had expected a representative, a liaison, someone whose job was to interface with alien refugees while the person in charge stayed on their own ship and managed things from a comfortable distance. Instead, the governor of Kepler Station walked through her docking bay in a jacket that had seen better days and boots that were built for function rather than ceremony, accompanied by 2 aides who were already talking into their communication devices. and a woman Daravas would later identify as Chief Engineer Rosa Domings, who looked at the last breath's interior with the specific expression of someone who has been given a very complicated puzzle and is already working on it. Webb was large, not aggressively, not in the way of the Krath, whose size was a deliberate instrument of intimidation. Large in the way of someone who had simply grown that way and had never found it particularly relevant. He had gray at his temples and the face of a man who had been making decisions for a long time and had learned to carry the weight of them without advertising it. He walked through the last breath. All of it, not a quick survey, a thorough one, moving through the corridors where her people were sleeping in shifts, through the cargo bays that had been converted to living spaces with the desperate ingenuity of a civilization reduced to improvisation, through the medical areas where her doctors were working with equipment that was failing in slow stages and had been failing for 11 days. He looked at everything. He did not flinch at any of it, and she had learned in 11 days that the things he was walking through made most people flinch. He asked specific questions, not diplomatic questions, practical ones. How long had the water recycling been running at reduced capacity? What was the failure mode on the secondary life support? How many of her engineers were still functional, meaning not in medical care, meaning capable of doing work? He took notes. Not on a device, on paper. A small notebook, which she found inexplicable in a species with the technology she had just watched drop out of FTL, until she realized it was not about the technology. It was about the act of writing things down, of making a physical record that existed independently of any system, of saying, these things matter enough to put them on paper. After 40 minutes he stopped in the main corridor junction, looked at his notebook and said to Domings, life support first, then structural, then power distribution. She said, already on it, he said. Water recycling is the critical path. She said, I know. He said, how long? She said, 8 hours if nothing goes wrong. He said, plan for something going wrong. She said, always do. Then he turned to Daravas. He said, your message, the one you transmitted. She said, I was making a memorial. I didn't expect. He said, I know. Can we sit somewhere? They found a space, a small equipment room off the main corridor, 2 crates that served as seats, no ceremony of any kind. Webb sat across from her and opened his notebook to a page and looked at it for a moment. He said, you listed the children first. She said, yes. He said, before the art and the medicine and the scientists, before everything else, you listed 4,216 children. She said, they are the whole point. Everything else is preparation for them. Webb looked at his notebook, then he closed it. He said, tell me about your engineers. How many, what disciplines, what condition? And they got to work. Rosa Domings had been building things in deep space for 20 years, and she had learned in 20 years that the difference between a structure that held and a structure that failed was almost never the materials and almost never the design, and almost always the person who was paying attention when the small thing went wrong before the large thing went wrong. She paid attention. She took her 200 engineers through the last breath in teams, 4 teams, 4 simultaneous work streams, each one assigned a critical system and given authority to do whatever was necessary to stabilize it. She did not hold briefings. She did not wait for consensus. She walked through the ship the way Webb had walked through it, looking at everything, and she triaged with the speed of someone who had done triage before in situations where the margin for error was the difference between people living and people not living. Life support was the worst, not because the failure was catastrophic. It wasn't, not yet, but because it was the kind of failure that was happening in 6 different places simultaneously, each one individually manageable and collectively lethal. She assigned 40 engineers to it and told them they had 8 hours and meant 6. Hull integrity was bad but stable, 17 impact points. 3 of which had been patched by Soren engineers with materials that were doing the job they needed to do and would continue doing that job for approximately 3 weeks. She assigned 30 engineers to reinforce the patches properly. Power distribution was a labyrinth. The last breath was 6,000 years old in her design language, modified and upgraded across centuries in ways that had made sense at the time, and had accumulated into something that required 20 years of experience to read correctly. Domings read it correctly in 4 hours, which was faster than her best engineer and faster than she had expected, and 2 hours slower than she needed. She was in the crawl space of the secondary power distribution hub, on her back, working on a coupling that should have been replaced 8 years ago, and had been kept running through a combination of Soren engineering ingenuity and what she was increasingly recognizing as sheer stubbornness, when she became aware that she was not alone. She turned her head. A young Soren male was crouched at the entrance to the crawlspace, watching her work. He was young, very young, 20 at the outside, with the blue-gray skin of his species and large eyes that were doing the specific thing eyes do when an intelligent being is absorbing information as fast as it can. He was not in her way. He was just watching. She said, "Can I help you?" He said, "I wanted to see how you were doing that." She said, "Do you have an engineering background?" He said, "I was studying for one, before." She looked at him for a moment. At his hands steady, she noticed. Calm. At the way he was positioned, not hovering, not anxious, just present in the way of someone who understood that presence required nothing except showing up and paying attention. She pulled a tool from her belt, held it out toward him. She said, "Hold this, don't let go." He took the tool, he did not let go. His name was Kale. She learned it 3 hours later when she needed to tell him to move to the left 14 centimeters, and using you felt insufficient for someone who had been holding tools and handing things and crawling into spaces she pointed at for 3 hours without being asked and without complaint. He said his name and went left 14 centimeters. She said, "Good, now hold that in place while I..." And they kept working. Colonel James Harker received the intelligence report at hour 8, while Domings was on her third workstream and Webb was in his second meeting with Dara Voss about the medium-term logistics of 40,000 people who needed somewhere to go. He read the report twice. The Craft Dominion had detected the distress signal, had also detected humanity's response, had done the calculation that the Craft Dominion always did, a military calculation, a political calculation, the specific arithmetic of a civilization that had eliminated 4 species in the last century by being willing to do what other civilizations found unthinkable. The calculation had produced an answer: send a fleet. Not to fight, the Krath were not stupid, they knew what fighting humanity meant. The knowledge of what fighting humanity meant had been distributed across the galaxy with the efficiency of a very good cautionary tale. Send a fleet to intimidate, to make the humans understand that the Soren survivors were a Krath matter, and that Krath matters were not open for external interference. 22 ships. Against Harker's 7. He put the report down. He sat with the numbers for a moment, not because he needed more time to understand them. He understood them immediately and completely, but because he had learned in 3 wars that there was value in sitting with numbers before you acted on them, in letting the implications settle rather than reacting to the surface. The implications were these: the Krath were coming. They would arrive in approximately 60 hours. Domings needed 72. That was the gap. 12 hours of gap between the moment the Krath arrived and the moment the last breath was stable enough to move. He stood up, went to find Webb. He found him in the corridor, moving between meetings, notebook in hand, coffee in the other hand that had been cold for at least an hour based on the fact that Webb was carrying it without drinking it. Harker fell into step beside him, said, "We have a problem." Webb said, "How big?" Harker said, 22 Krath ships, 60 hours. Webb said, Domings needs 72. Harker said, I know. Webb said, can you buy her the difference? Harker looked at the corridor around him. At the Soren survivors in it, the adults trying to hold themselves together, the children who had stopped understanding what was happening and had arrived at the particular exhausted calm of children who have been scared for too long, the elderly who sat against the walls with expressions that had gone somewhere else and might not come back. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at Webb. He said, I can buy her what she needs. Webb stopped walking, looked at him. He said, you understand what that might mean. Harker said, I've been in 3 wars. I understand exactly what it might mean. Webb said, and Harker said, and those are 40,000 people. And Domings has 200 engineers on a ship that needs 72 hours. And you're standing in a corridor with cold coffee making a list of everything that needs fixing. He paused. We didn't come out here to leave. Webb looked at him for a moment. Then he said, all right, do it. Harker went to do it. Daravas found out about the Krath fleet from Kale. He had been passing through the communications section on his way to the structural bay where Domings had sent him for a specific tool, and he had overheard 2 of Harker's officers discussing approach vectors and engagement windows in the specific clipped language of military people discussing things that were serious without performing the seriousness. He was 20 years old and he had been a student of structural engineering before the world ended, and he did not know military language, but he knew enough to understand what he had heard. He told Daravas. He told her plainly, without softening it, because she was the elder counselor and had spent 11 days handling things without softening, and she would not want it softened now. She went to find Webb. She found him in the engineering assessment bay, looking at Domings's damage report on a display, his notebook open beside it, cross-referencing. She walked in and said, the Krath are coming. He said, yes. She said, you need to leave. He looked up from the display. She said, take your ships and your engineers and go. The Krath will not stop. I have seen what they do when they decide something is finished. They destroyed our world from orbit in 6 hours. 6 hours. You have 7 ships. They are sending 22. You cannot hold them. And you barely know us. We are 40,000 survivors of a species you had never encountered before 6 hours ago. We are not worth a war. Webb was quiet for a moment. He set down his notebook. He looked at her with the specific attention of a man who is about to say something true and wants to make sure it lands correctly. He said, your message, the one you sent. She said, I told you it was a memorial. He said, you listed the children first. She stopped. He said, I have read a lot of distress calls in my career. I have read formal requests and emergency transmissions and automated beacon data and every variation of a civilization reaching out into the dark hoping someone is listening. He picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down again. In 30 years, I have never heard anyone list the children first, before the strategic assets, before the population numbers, before the survival statistics. You listed 4,216 children, and you listed them first because they were the most important thing. He looked at her. He said, anyone who does that, anyone who is in the worst moment of their existence and still knows that the children are the first thing, the most important thing, the whole point of everything else, that is not a species you leave in the dark. He picked up his notebook. He said, we were always going to come, and we are not going to leave. Daravas looked at him for a long moment. At this human with his cold coffee and his paper notebook, and his 200 engineers taking apart her ship to put it back together. At the particular quality of certainty in his voice, not aggressive certainty, not the certainty of power asserting itself, but the quieter and more durable certainty of someone who has decided something and is not going to undecide it regardless of what happens next. She said, the Krath have eliminated 4 species. He said, I know. She said, they will not be intimidated. He said, that's all right. We're not trying to intimidate them. She said, then what are you trying to do? He said, buy Doming's 72 hours. He looked at his notebook. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to figure out the food supply situation because 6 days of emergency rations for 40,000 people requires a distribution system, and I haven't built one yet. He went back to his list. Harker took his fleet out at hour 12. 7 ships, moving in formation through the Riffin corridor toward the Krath approach vector, the specific formation of a military force that intends to be seen and intends its position to be unambiguous. He did not try to conceal them. He did not try to appear larger than he was or more numerous than he was. 7 ships against 22 was 7 ships against 22, and the Krath would know the numbers as well as he did, and pretending otherwise would accomplish nothing, except making him look like someone who didn't understand the situation. He understood the situation. He positioned his fleet directly in the Krath's approach vector, not at weapons range, not aggressively, but in the specific location that said, to reach what you are coming for, you will come through us. Not a threat. A fact. The statement of a position and an intention, clear and unambiguous, in the language that military forces of every species used when they wanted to communicate without words. He held position. His crew waited. They were good, the kind of good that came from serving together long enough that the waiting did not produce the kind of anxiety that waiting usually produced, that had been converted instead into the particular focused calm of people who have decided they are going to do what needs doing and are saving their energy for the doing. The Krath fleet dropped out of FTL at hour 14. 22 ships, larger than his, most of them, the Krath built for mass, for presence, for the specific visual and tactical weight of a civilization that had learned that looking overwhelming was often as effective as being overwhelming. They arranged themselves in the formation the Krath used for intimidation operations, not a battle formation, a display formation, designed to communicate scale. Harker looked at the display, at 22 ships, at the numbers he had already done the math on. His tactical officer said, "They're hailing." He said, "Put it through." The Krath commander appeared on his display. Large, armored, with the specific bearing of a military officer who had done this before, the confrontation of a lesser force, the communication of overwhelming advantage, the invitation to make the correct decision. He spoke in the Krath military language, which Harker's translator rendered in real time. The commander said, "You are in a restricted operational corridor. Stand aside." Harker said, "We are holding position." The commander said, "You have 7 vessels, we have 22. The mathematics are not in your favor." Harker said, "I can count." The commander said, "Then count again and make a better decision." Harker said nothing. The Krath fleet advanced. Slowly, not an attack, a pressure, the application of physical presence as a form of argument. Harker watched them come on his display and did not move. His weapons officer flagged engagement solutions on 4 Krath vessels. Within range, good solutions, the kind of solutions you could act on if acting was what you had decided to do. He had not decided to act, not yet. The Krath continued to advance, into engagement range. His tactical officer reported it quietly, the way trained people report things that require nodding but do not require alarm. Harker acknowledged it and held position. The Krath lead ship fired. Not at his fleet. Into the space beside it, 300 meters to starboard, a weapons discharge that was precisely calculated to be exactly close enough to be a message and exactly far enough to not be a provocation. A demonstration of capability and intent. The universal military language for, the next one will not miss. His crew was very still. His weapons officer had updated solutions on 8 Krath vessels now. Good solutions, the kind you could act on. Harker looked at his chronometer. Hour 14. Domings had been working for 14 hours. She needed 72. He needed to give her 58 more hours. He opened a channel, not to the Krath, to Webb. He said, "Governor, I need you to do something for me." Webb was in the food distribution planning session when the channel opened. He excused himself, stepped into the corridor, and listened to Harker explain what he needed in 45 seconds of very clear and specific language. Webb said, "Give me 10 minutes." He went to find Dara Voss. He found her in the medical bay, where she had been since hour 10, helping where she could and mostly providing the specific presence that 40,000 frightened people needed from their last surviving senior leader. The evidence that someone was still standing, still thinking, still there. He pulled her aside, told her what he was going to do, asked her permission. She looked at him. She said, "My message." He said, "Your message, everything in it. Broadcast on every open frequency in the corridor, every monitoring station in range, every galactic relay we can reach." He paused, not as a weapon, as a record. Whatever happens next, it will happen in front of everyone who can hear it. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about recording the message in the red emergency light at 300, about how she had been making a memorial because she was out of other options, about listing the children first because they were the first thing and the most important thing, and she had wanted whoever found the record someday to understand that. She said, "Use it." Webb opened a broadcast channel. Not encrypted, not directed. Open, every frequency his communications array could reach simultaneously, the broadcast equivalent of standing in the center of a room and speaking clearly so that every person in the room could hear. He played Dara Voss's message, all 40 minutes of it, the 6,000 years of civilization, the art and the medicine and the science, the names of the researchers, the architectural tradition. The children listed first, 4,216 of them. When it finished, he added one line in his own voice. He said, "Humanity has heard this message. Humanity has responded. We are here. What happens next will also be heard. By everyone within range of this transmission." He paused. "By everyone within range of the stations that will relay it. By everyone those stations reach." He closed the broadcast. He called Harker back. He said, "Done." Harker looked at his display, at the Krath fleet which had stopped advancing, which was transmitting back to the Dominion, encrypted, the volume and frequency of a fleet command that has received unexpected new information and is asking for updated orders. He waited. The updated orders took 40 minutes. He watched the Krath fleet hold position while the Dominion worked the problem. The political problem. The problem that Webb's broadcast had created. The problem of a record that was now moving outward from the Riffin corridor at the speed of light towards 17 monitoring stations and the civilizations that maintained them. Harker understood what the Krath were calculating. He understood it because he was doing the same calculation from the other side. The elimination of the Soren survivors, if it happened in a remote corridor with no witnesses, was a Krath military operation. If it happened while humanity watched, while Webb's broadcast was in the relay system, while the record was being made, it was something else. Something the Dominion's political apparatus would have to manage for years. Something that would follow them. The Krath commander opened a channel. He said, "You broadcast that message." Harker said, "The governor did." The commander said, "It will reach 17 monitoring stations." Harker said, "At minimum." A silence. The commander said, "You would have fought us. 7 ships against 22, you would have fought." Harker said, "Yes." The commander said, "Why?" Harker thought about Domings and her 200 engineers taking apart a dying ship to put it back together. About Webb and his paper notebook and his cold coffee and his list of everything that needed fixing. About 40,000 survivors and 4,216 children listed first. About the specific and stubborn and deeply human quality of showing up completely, with everything you had, for people you had never met, Because they had listed the children first, and anyone who listed the children first was worth showing up for. He said, because that's what we do. The Krath commander was quiet for a moment. Then he said, we are withdrawing. Harker said, I know. The Krath fleet turned, not immediately with the deliberate, measured movement of a military force that is withdrawing on its own terms and wants that understood. But it turned. 22 ships, reconfiguring from display formation to transit formation, their approach vector becoming a departure vector. Harker watched them go. His weapons officer said, very quietly, they're really leaving. Harker said, yes. His tactical officer said, we didn't fire a shot. Harker said, no. He looked at the display, at the Krath fleet moving away, at the Riffin corridor behind them, the last breath sitting in it with 17 human ships around her and 200 engineers inside her. We didn't need to. He opened the channel to Webb. He said, corridor is clear. Webb said, how long do we have? Harker said, long enough. Domings has 58 hours. Webb said, she'll be done in 50. Harker said, she usually is. Kale had been inside the structural beam, housing for 17 hours, when the tool started losing power. He knew it before the indicator showed it, felt the resistance change in his hands, the subtle shift in how the weld was taking. He had been in the housing for 17 hours, moving through a space 2 feet wide and running the length of the ship, doing by hand what could not be done from outside, because the damage was in the places that outside access could not reach. Domings's voice came through his earpiece. She said, tools losing power. He said, I feel it. She said, bypass the primary cell, route through the secondary. You'll lose 20% efficiency, but you'll gain 4 more hours of operation. He said, how do I? She told him, exactly, step by step, in the specific and patient way she had been talking him through things for 17 hours, not simplified, not condescending, the real instructions, the ones that assumed he could follow them if she explained them clearly enough. He followed them. The tool came back up. 80% efficiency, the indicator said. Doming said, good. 3 more sections and you're done with the midship reinforcement. Then aft and you're out. He said, how long for aft? She said, 3 hours if the housing doesn't shift. He started moving. At hour 17, the housing shifted. He heard it before he felt it, a sound that was not loud but was the kind of sound that contains information beyond its volume, the specific groan of stressed metal finding a new equilibrium. He went completely still. The housing settled around him, not collapsing, not failing but moving, the beam adjusting under the ship's own weight as the last breath systems came back online section by section, and the load distribution changed. Domings heard it through the comm. She said, Kale, don't move. He said, I hear it. She said, give me 30 seconds. He waited. He was very still in the 2-foot space with the shifted housing around him, and the tool in his hands, and 30 hours of work behind him, and 3 hours of work ahead of him. And he was completely still. And he thought about his home world which no longer existed and his family who were somewhere on this ship alive. Because the ship was still holding together. And the ship was still holding together. Because 200 human engineers had spent the last 40 hours making it hold together. And he thought about a woman named Rosa Domings who had handed him a tool 19 hours ago and said, hold this. Don't let go. And he was still holding it. Domings came back on. She said, Kale. He said, yes. She said, the shift changed the load on the aft section. The fracture is propagating faster than my original estimate. She paused. You have 12 minutes to finish the aft reinforcement before the beam fails. He said, 12 minutes. She said, it might not be enough, if you need to come out. He said, Rosa. She said, yes. He said, it's enough. She said, Kale. He said, I have been inside this beam for 17 hours. I know where everything is. I can do the aft section in 12 minutes. He started moving. Trust me. A brief silence. She said, I do, go. He went. He moved through the housing with the particular focused speed of someone who has been in a space long enough to know it completely, who has learned every curve and junction by touch, who does not need to think about where to put his hands because his hands already know. The tool at 80% efficiency. The housing shifted but stable. 12 minutes on a clock he was running in his head because there was no display in the housing, just his internal count and the work, and the sound of the beam around him telling him things in the language of stressed metal that he had spent 17 hours learning to read. 8 minutes. 6. 4. 2. He finished the last weld and held the tool in place for the full cure time, 20 seconds, because rushing the cure was how welds failed, and he had not spent 30 hours in a structural beam housing to have the weld fail in 20 seconds. He held it. The beam was very still around him. The housing was quiet. 20 seconds. He released the tool and started moving toward the exit. He came out of the housing at hour 30. He sat on the floor of the structural bay and did not immediately move because 30 hours required a moment of not moving, and Doming sat next to him and also did not move, and the bay was quiet except for the sound of the ship around them, running, stable, holding. After 2 minutes she said, "The beam is holding." He said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "My people are on this ship." She looked at him, at his hands, which had weld marks on them that would scar, at his face, which had the exhaustion of someone who has used everything they had and used it for something worth using it for, at the specific quality that was present in him now that had not been present 30 hours ago, something earned, something that changed the shape of a person. She said, "You're going to be one hell of an engineer." He looked at his hands, the weld marks, the tool he was still holding, the first one she had handed him, 19 hours into what had become 30, the one she had said, "Don't let go." He said, "If there's still something to build." She said, "There's always something to build. That's the one thing I can promise you." He looked at her. She said, "I have been building things in deep space for 20 years. I have built stations and habitats and repair platforms and emergency shelters and 17 different things that people said couldn't be built in the time available." She paused. "There is always something to build. There is never a shortage of things to build. The universe is very large and very empty, and humanity has been filling it for 250 years, and we have barely started." She looked at him. She said, "We're going to need engineers." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Sarin engineers." She said, "Engineers." She shrugged slightly. "The beam doesn't care where you're from. The weld either holds or it doesn't." He looked at the housing, at the sealed access port, at what was behind it, 30 hours of work, 300 meters of reinforced structural beam, the thing that had been failing and was now not failing and would not fail because he had gone in and made it not fail. He said, "It holds." She said, "It holds." They sat together on the floor of the structural bay of the last breath, a human engineer and a Sarin student who was going to be an engineer, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the ship held around them, and outside in the Riffin corridor the Krath fleet was gone, and 17 human ships kept watch, and 40,000 people were alive. Hour 71. The last breath was stable, full life support, hull integrity at 87%, better than Domings had projected, because Kale had found 3 additional stress points during his time in the housing and had reinforced them without being asked. Power distribution running clean, water recycling at full capacity. Food distribution system operational, designed by Webb in a 3-hour session with Dara Voss's logistics team, and implemented by a combination of human engineers and Sarin volunteers who had nothing else to do with their hands, and found that having something to do with their hands was better than not having something to do with their hands. Daravas found Webb in the corridor, outside the main cargo bay. He was sitting on a crate. His notebook was in his pocket. His coffee was cold. She had learned that his coffee was always cold, that he poured it and then became occupied with things and forgot to drink it until it had been cold for an hour, and then drank it anyway because the point had never been the temperature. He was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has been operating on 4 hours of sleep for 3 days and is taking a brief, deliberate pause before the next thing. She sat across from him on another crate. The corridor was quiet. Around them, the last breath moved not physically, but in the way that a living thing moves, the constant small adjustments of 40,000 people existing inside it, the sounds of a ship that was functioning, that had been not functioning, and was now functioning because of the people sitting in this corridor, and the people who had worked alongside them. She said, "I made that message as a memorial." He said, "I know." She said, "I did not expect anyone to come. I had sent 4 distress calls. I was out of expectations." He said, "I know." She said, "Why did you come? Not strategically, not politically. You personally, why did you get on a ship and come here?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. The kind of thinking that looks for the true answer rather than the convenient one. He said, "You listed the children first." She waited. He said, "In 30 years I have received a lot of communications from civilizations in crisis, formal requests, emergency transmissions, distress calls from species I had never heard of in situations I could not have anticipated." He looked at the cold coffee. "In 30 years I have never once heard anyone list the children first. Not first among the priorities, not first among the things to save, first in the message. The first thing you wanted whoever found it to know about your people." He looked at her. He said, "You were making a memorial. You wanted whoever found it someday to know who the Sauron were. And the first thing you wanted them to know, before the science and the art and the medicine and everything your civilization had built in 6,000 years, was that there were 4,216 children." He picked up the cold coffee. He said, "Anyone who does that, anyone who is in the worst moment of their civilization's existence and still understands that the children are the first thing, the most important thing, the reason everything else exists, I don't know what word you'd use for that. We'd call it knowing what matters." He drank the cold coffee. He said, "We were always going to come. Anyone who knows what matters, you come for them. That's not strategy. That's just what you do." Daravas looked at him for a long time. She thought about 11 days, about 4 distress calls and 4 silences, and the decision at 300 to make a memorial instead of another call, about recording for 40 minutes in the red emergency light, about listing the children first because they were the first thing, and she had wanted whoever found it to understand that before they understood anything else. She thought about 17 ships dropping out of FTL 6 hours later. She said, "We have no home now." He said, "Yes, you do." She said, "The Sauron home world." He said, "Is gone." Yes, he looked at his notebook. "But a home isn't a planet." He paused. "A home is a place where people know what you've been through and what you're worth and are willing to do the work of making sure you're all right." He looked at her. "You have that. It's not the one you had. It's in a different place and it looks different and it's going to take time to build. But it exists." She said, "Why would you do that? For 40,000 survivors of a species you had never met." He said the same thing Harker had said to the Krath commander. The same 4 words, the same tone, the same quality of certainty that was not aggressive and not performed but simply present, like a foundation that had been there a long time and was not going anywhere. He said, "Because that's what we do." The last breath moved at hour 72. Not fast, she was stable, not healed. And stable was what Domings had promised, and stable was what had been delivered. She moved at the pace of a ship that knew where it was going and was going there carefully, with the particular deliberateness of something that had been through a great deal and was not in a hurry to be through more. Around her, 17 human ships formed up. Not in the loose formation of an escort, in a specific configuration, one that Harker had designed and briefed his captains on at hour 68, a formation that said, "This ship is with us." That communicated in the language that military formations communicate in, a relationship and an intention and a commitment. The last breath was in the middle. The human ships were around her, and they moved together through the Riffin corridor toward human space, toward Kepler Station, toward the place that was going to become, in the months and years ahead, a different kind of home for 40,000 people who had not expected to survive long enough to need one. Inside the last breath, Cale was asleep on the floor of the structural bay, Domings's jacket over him because it had been the nearest thing available, and she had not needed it, and he had needed something. She was at the engineering console, running post-repair diagnostics with the focused attention of someone who will run them until they come back clean and will not stop until they do. Webb was in the logistics section, on his third meeting of the hour, his notebook open, his coffee cold, working through the medium-term planning for 40,000 people with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has decided this is the job and is doing it. Harker was on his own bridge, his fleet around him, watching the corridor behind them on long-range sensors with the patient attention of someone who has learned that things that leave sometimes come back. And Daravas was at the viewport. She watched human space grow closer, not visible yet, too far, but present in the way that destinations are present when you are moving toward them. She watched the stars. She thought about 6,000 years of Soren civilization and what was left of it and what could be built from what was left. She thought about a student named Cale who had spent 30 hours in a structural beam housing because his people were on the ship. She thought about a woman named Rosa Domings who had handed him a tool and said, "Don't let go." She thought about a colonel who had held position with 7 ships against 22 because that was what they did. She thought about a governor with a paper notebook and cold coffee who had said, "Anyone who lists the children first." She had spent 11 days looking for a word. The right word for what had happened, for what humanity was, for the specific quality she had encountered in every human she had met, since 17 ships dropped out of FTL 6 hours after her memorial. She had found it. Not in the Soren language, not in the translation matrices or the diplomatic terminology or the formal vocabulary of interspecies contact. She had found it in the simplest possible place. Webb had said it. Harker had said it. Domings had said it to Cale when he came out of the housing. There's always something to build. That was the word. Not a word, a truth. The specific and stubborn and apparently non-negotiable human truth that there was always something to build and therefore always a reason to keep going, always a next thing, always a reason that the current situation, however terrible, was not the end. 6,000 years of Soren civilization. 40,000 survivors. 4,216 children. There was always something to build. Daravas looked at the stars. She thought, "We have lost everything." She thought, "And we have not lost everything." She thought, "The children are listed first because they are the first thing and the most important thing, and they are alive. They are alive because 17 ships came. Because 200 engineers spent 72 hours. Because a colonel held position with 7 ships against 22, and the answer to why was 4 words that were also a foundation." She thought, "We will build something." She did not know what yet. That was all right. Webb had said a home is a place where people know what you've been through. She was beginning to know what that meant. She watched the stars. Behind her, the last breath held together. Around her, 17 human ships held formation. Ahead, growing closer by the minute, the place that was going to be home. There was always something to build. She was beginning to believe it.